I always love when elders come in and get to talk to us. Whew. All right. Wow, what an intro. All right. So, but really, we're thankful that our elders are willing to come in here and speak to us and get to know us. And it's something that is unique for us. So I'm glad that they care about us and that they're willing to come in here and talk to us and such. So jokes aside, I'm thankful for Mr. Bravo coming in here and doing that. So we're about to start a new series, and it's one I've been thinking about for a little bit, and it's just looking at the spiritual journeys of certain people throughout the Bible. People that we don't talk about very often, and talking about them within under the lens of what was the spiritual journey that they went through. And so we're not going to talk about the Pauls, even though his journey is incredible, and the Peters, even though his journey is incredible, because we talk about them a lot. And so instead we're going to talk about we're going to try to really dive into some of the people throughout the Bible that maybe we don't talk about quite as much, but that we can really learn from. And the first one that we're going to do is Job. And Job is one that is talked about a relatively decent amount. But I think that tonight we're going to be able to look at it under a little bit of a different lens and learn something from this. And this was one that I really enjoyed studying and preparing for, so I hope that you also enjoy learning from as well. Bum, bum, bum. No, you're good. Take your time. It's okay. I forgive you. So within there's many accounts of people who follow God, obviously, on their spiritual journeys throughout the Bible. And they allow their faith to be transformed or molded by their experience on this earth. Many of these people are put through situations that are difficult and confusing and inexplicable on this earth. And it influences the strength of one's faith. And some of them endure and become stronger because of this test. And then some of them sadly give in. And so that's going to be a common theme that you see throughout all of these, is that they're going through something difficult or confusing or just a hard time, and how do they overcome this? And so when you think of someone that's had like a terrible day, maybe you think of the worst day that you've ever had. I think about like the day after I turned 20 and I realized that Billy's pressure washer had been stolen out of my garage, and I backed into a car on the same day, almost at the exact same time. It was like a $600 day. And so that was a pretty terrible day. You probably have a pretty terrible day in mind for you as well. But when you think of someone in the Bible that had like the worst day possible, Job is probably in your at least like top 3. Job had a really bad day. And so tonight we're going to look at the really painful part of the journey that Job took on his walk with God. And the first thing I want to look at is how Job was described before everything happened, what his life was like. He was described as the greatest of all of the people of the East. In Job 1 through 5, there are words described him blameless. And the word blameless we see describing Noah, David, Daniel, and that's all. There might be more, but that's all that I could find. Blameless is kind of an elite word, not used to describe a whole lot of people. And Job is described as blameless, upright. He feared God and he turned away from evil. He was one of, if not the wealthiest man on the earth at the time. I mean, it says that he's the greatest of all the people of the East. He was a leader. He cared about his family. He followed God, and he wanted to make sure that his family was seen in the same light as him. We can see that because it says in Job 1 through 5 that he had a lot of children, and these children would sometimes go into this house, this area, and they would, like the brothers would invite the sisters, and they would all like eat and drink and be merry, is what it said. And then it said that Job afterwards, after they would do this on whatever day that they would go, the next day he would go and he would offer a burnt offering for them, because it says maybe they cursed God in their hearts, or maybe that they did something wrong, and Job is saying, like, I want to make sure that they're okay, like that their sins are atoned for. And so he would go hike up and do a burnt offering for them. And so he cared about his family, and he was a leader in his family, and he was righteous and blameless. And he cared about God and making sure that his family was fearing him as well. And so Job's faith becomes tested. And we see that in verses 6 through 12. It says that the sons of God were coming to meet God in this area, and Satan appeared. And God said, "What are you doing here? Like, why are you here?" And so Satan says, "Well, I've been walking to and fro throughout the earth, and I've been trying to find someone." And God says, "Well, have you noticed my servant Job? Like, he's great. He fears me, and he's upright, and he's blameless, and he loves me, and he's living for me." And so Satan says, "Well, let's see how long this lasts. Like, let's see if I test him, I think that he will fail you. I think that he will turn from you." And so God says, "Oh, I have it up here. I didn't realize that." God says that you can do that, and you can stretch out your hand, and you can touch all that he has. But Satan says that he will curse you to your face, and God says that, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do you not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out of the presence of the Lord. So God basically says, look, you can touch anything around him. You can do whatever you want to the things around him, but don't touch him. Like, don't mess with him or his health or anything that is directly involving him. So we see a few different interesting things in this passage. We see that one, that Satan is constantly walking the earth. Something about Satan is that he hates you. Like, he wants you to fail. And that's strong language, but it's easily apparent just in this story that Satan hates you. He hates those who are trying to live for Christ. And he wants you to do wrong. He wants you to have a difficult and terrible life. Like, he's not your friend. He's always looking for a way to cause you to do wrong. And then verse 8. It says that God is the one that brings up Job. It's not Satan. It's God that says, "Have you noticed my servant Job?" He noticed that Job was righteous, but he also knows Job's situation. And he wants Job to be tested in his life. And if he didn't, then he wouldn't have allowed Satan to do it in the first place. If God didn't want Satan to do all of these things, then he would have never allowed it to happen in the first place. Verses 9 through 11. Talks about that Job's faith really hadn't been tested. Satan says that you've put a hedge around him. Like, you've allowed him to live isolated from a hard life. Like, he's had it easy, I guess, is what Satan's trying to get across. So he's saying, well, he's had it so easy, he hasn't been tested, so of course it's going to be easy for him to live for you, but let me test him. He lives his life of wealth. He has everything he wants. He's never had to struggle with his faith because he's had everything that he's wanted. Faith is influenced, it can be influenced by one's own earthly experiences. Many of us perceive God and the church and maybe what our spiritual life should look like differently. If I asked each of you separately to describe God or to describe what the church meant to you or what your relationship with God looked like, I'd have a huge variety of different answers because all of our life experiences have been different. Some of us might see God as more of a father figure, while others might see God as the creator and the almighty. And while we can say that he is all of those things, in my mind, I might see God more as a father than someone else, if that makes sense to you. So we all can somewhat perceive God a little bit differently while all worshiping the same God. But that's because of your life experience. And it's because of the things that you've been through. And Job's life experience lacked trials. So his faith was untested. And so verse 12 is God, he could be caring for his faith. And when he says, don't stretch out your hand against him directly. Like, don't mess with his health. God could be caring for his health. Or he could be kind of evaluating where Job's allegiance is. Like, does he worship his possessions or does he worship God? And so God's about to find out. So Job's possessions are taken away. His cattle was taken by the Sabians, which is just this group of people that were enemies of Israel and over time. But the cattle were taken away by Sabians and their servants were killed. Job's servants were killed. And then a fire burned up his sheep and his servants. And it said the fire came from above is what the servant that came to Job said. And so it said immediately after this, all these things happen immediately after each other. So it says right after this, another servant came up and said that the Chaldeans had stole all of his camels and killed all the servants that were there. And then another servant comes and says that all of his children had died in a house. The house had collapsed while they were eating and drinking wine. And so something I said earlier is that Job always goes, after they're done eating and drinking in the house, Job always goes and he offers a burnt offering for them. And so do you think that maybe Satan, you're going to notice Satan's strategy throughout all this, that there's a reason behind everything that he does. And so maybe Satan decided to do it in this time because Job would have to constantly live with the idea that I wasn't able to offer that burnt offering afterwards. Like they died in the state that they were in, and I wasn't able to offer anything for them. Like that's kind of a tormenting thought to think about. And so all of his children die in this house. And so Job is having to endure all of these things happening back to back to back to back to back. He's getting all of this news in. And this is how he reacts. Ethan, can you read 20-23?
Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground in worship. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And all this Job did not sin or charge God with wrong.
Just these 3 verses, I think, tells us so much about the character of Job. When everything is taken away from him, how does he react? How would we react? Like I tried to put myself, I really can't, I'm not capable of putting myself through the kind of mindset that Job is having to experience here. But if you were to do that, like by no means would I react this way, I don't think. Like I don't think that is how I would respond, but Job immediately falls and he worships. Like it's like mind-boggling to me. I would probably react with pain, and I'd be angry, and I'd be confused. And so by no means would worship be my first reaction. But while Job experiences all of these things, his first reaction is to worship. So then Job's faith is tested through his health. In Job chapter 2, verses 1 through 6, we see a really similar thing happening where the sons of God, meet together and Satan comes, and it's almost the same exact wording until Satan says, okay, well, he endured all these things that I did, and he stayed faithful to you, yeah, but what if I test him specifically? Like, what if I stretch out my hand and I touch him and I make him unhealthy? He won't still. Like, he will not put you over his own health and over him. And so God allows that to happen, and we're able to see. Does Job love God more than his wealth and his good fortune? Does he love God more than his own quality of life, is what we're about to learn. So in verse 7, it says that Job was struck with sores. And we don't exactly know the condition, but here's some things that we do know. It says that he had itchy skin, disfiguration, horrible sores that scabbed over and cracked and oozed, which is really disgusting to think about. Their sores were like infected with worms. He had fever with chills, darkening and shriveling of the skin. Eyes were red and swollen from weeping. He had stomach trouble. It says that literally Job's bowels were violently heated and agitated. In chapter 30, verse 27. He was sleepless and he had nightmares. It said he had bad breath, extreme weight loss, excruciating and ceaseless pain. And so whether this was leprosy or something else, Satan certainly knew how to afflict Job in a variety of persistently painful ways. Job's physical, emotional, and spiritual pain drove him outside of the city walls. This is a quote from a guy named Hartley who wrote a book about this. He said that it drove him outside the city walls to the town's ash heap, a collection of the ashes from the city's ovens, broken pots, and other refuse. On the ash heap, Job sat alone, totally isolated from the community's life, as he mourned his terrible fate in silence. So he was miserable, and he knew that he couldn't really be fixed. Like there's not like some sort of cream or something that can just fix Job in this time. He's affected every time that he moves. He's affected the way that he looks at himself and that others look at him. Satan hates Job, and he was strategic in his punishment of his body, of his health. He wanted to destroy Job's quality of life, his own self-image, and how others saw him. So the question arises here soon, is Job actually righteous? Thus began Job's search for the meaning of life in the face of death. In chapter 2, verse 9, his wife pretty much just says, why are you still serving God? And why are you still pledging your allegiance to him only, like, look at all these things that has happened to you. So she just says, why not just curse God and die? And he's basically like, who are you? Like, why would you say that? But his wife has gone from watching him be the greatest man or one of the greatest men in the world to the scum of the earth in a period of, I would guess, a relatively short time. And not only that, is she is also having to endure the pain of her children dying and all these things that Job owned also going away. So she's having to endure this pain, and she's seeing him completely differently than however long before when everything was going great. He went from a man of good fortune and wealth and health to someone who should just, in her eyes, give up life and give up his allegiance to God and to just die. So who else is there for Job to turn to? Job should be able to go to the person who he was actually one flesh with, but now he has nobody. And then at the end of verse 10, it says, in all of these things, Job did not sin with his lips. So again, we see the integrity of Job and his willingness to stay true to God. So in verses 11 through 13, we see Job's friends come. And his friends come with good intentions. It names them as Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. Now, does anybody know how tall Bildad actually was? Quick fun fact question. I would say that he was probably around Shuhite or so. Anyways. Man. All right, sorry. Whew, that was awesome. All right. I'm glad that it took some time. All right, let's reel it back in. So your friends, these friends are coming and they have good intentions. Have you ever had to like comfort someone and just like not know what to do? Like something really terrible happens and you go up and you're like, and you just don't know like how to react. Like, should you put your arm around them, or should you say something nice to them, or should you sit there? That's probably how I would be. Like, I'd walk up to this and see Job in the absolute worst moment of his life, in like the valley of valleys, and he probably looks disgusting, and he's out where nobody else is, away from the community, and his friends are walking up, and it says that they just sat with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and they mourned with him, and they shared in his pain. Like, those are good friends. Like, I would hope that, my friends would probably respond in the same way. Like, they would be willing to kind of help me carry that burden and just be there for me in my time of need, in the time when I'm in the valley of valleys. And so when I was reading this, I was like, man, Job's got some good friends. They went outside the city to this man who was the scum of the earth and cast out from everyone else, and they mourned with him for 7 straight days. So Job finally has something going for him, it looks like, until he doesn't. Job starts to say, he kind of breaks the silence, I guess, after 7 days, and he curses the day that he was born. And so in this section of 26 verses, he talks about how he wished that he wasn't even born. Like, he'd rather not even be alive and never have experienced life at all than experience what is happening to him right now. And in the last verse, he says, I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. And so Eliphaz, one of his friends, answers. And it's not with comfort of like, oh, dude, no, we're really glad that you were born, or anything like that. It's, he answers with like this attempt to try to answer for God and what God did. Like, this man is about to give an explanation of God's actions. So I hope that you can see the I don't even know what the word would be here, like the inequation, I don't know, that's happening between the man trying to give an explanation for God's actions. But he talks about this doctrine of retribution, which is just the idea that the righteous are always blessed and the wicked are always punished. So what do you, Open Floor, think about this doctrine before we keep going? The idea that the righteous are always blessed while the wicked are always punished. Does God take care of his people? Think about Job right now. What do you think about this?
Logically it seems to make sense. I guess since you read it But I guess, like, in hindsight, it's 2020. So, like, looking back, you're like, oh, well, he said always, but in this case, he was wrong. But in the same sense, maybe he's just, like, trying to justify, trying to figure it out when he should have just probably been there.
Yeah, like trying to just come up with an answer. And later on, you see a guy, and we'll talk about it in a second, but this guy, Elihu, after they argue about it for like 38 chapters, or 37 or something like that, this guy, Elihu, is like mad at pretty much everybody. And we'll get there in a second. But pretty much just because nobody could actually find an answer. And his friends hold fast to this idea that Job did something wrong. Like, if the righteous are always blessed and the wicked are always punished, then Job must have been wicked. He must have done something wrong. So Job's righteousness is called into question. Is Job righteous? So Job's in a state of mind at this point, I would think, where he's constantly in pain. His confidence is crushed. Everyone he loves has turned on him or has died. He's alone. He's vulnerable. He's confused as to why all this would happen to him because he's blameless and upright man that feared God. And he's having to clear himself from the accusation that he did something wrong by his friends. Do you think that Job might have ever questioned himself in this? His friends constantly throughout the book are telling him, you must have done something wrong. Like, obviously you did something wrong. All these things happened. You did something wrong, Job. You did something wrong. Do you think that Job ever questioned himself? Like, I probably would have questioned myself. Like, maybe I did something wrong. Like, maybe I don't know. Maybe I upset God in some way. That's probably what I would be thinking. But Job answers sure of himself. Like, he knows that he did nothing wrong. He compares himself to a worker who's like waiting to get paid and just knows that he never will. Or a slave it says that a slave that is just longing to see his own shadow, like ready for the sun to go down. He has no hope, and he just doesn't know why he doesn't have hope. He knows that he's righteous and that he lived in upright manner, but yet he feels as though he has no hope. And later on, he will say that God is my only hope. But at this point, he feels hopeless, really. So then Bildad asked the question in chapter 8, verse 3. Does God pervert justice? Is God just up to this point? It's a question that is constantly asked throughout the book. Something that you really have to constantly ask yourself is the theme of the justice of God. At what point does God in this story, does he ever become unjust? What is fair and what is unfair is something that, as humans, I would say that reading this book, you kind of constantly wrestle with. Like, wow, Job didn't deserve that, I would think. Like, wow, that's really harsh. Like, why is this happening? And you're constantly asking yourself this. And so Bildad's saying, does God pervert justice? To justify the idea that you must have done something wrong. Because only the wicked get punished, and you're obviously getting punished. And God is a just God, and if God's a just God and the wicked always get punished, that equals, Job, you did something wrong. And so that was his point. So Job says in chapter 9, verse 15, he says, though I am in the right, so Job's saying, I am right. He says, though I am in the right, I cannot answer him. I must appeal for mercy to my accuser. Job has no answer for what is happening to the question of God's justice, but he knows that he hasn't done anything wrong. And so he holds fast to what he knows to be true, that he is still righteous and he's still blameless. But then 6 verses later, he also says, I loathe my life. Job hates that he lives. Although he knows that he's blameless before God and he holds true to that, that doesn't change the fact that his spirit is crushed right now. He has he says that he's got no hope and nothing good left in life. And his friends keep telling him that he's wrong and all these terrible things are happening. And he says, I loathe my life. And then in chapter 10, we see that Job questions God. He asks him, why is this happening? He says, why did you even allow me to be born if this was going to be my fate? Am I blameless? Because if so, then why am I being treated this way? Why, if I am blameless and upright, and I have walked in accordance with what you would have me do, and I have feared you my whole life, why is this happening to me? And so he's questioning God. He doesn't understand. He's confused. So, is it wrong to question?
think it's human nature to want to have answers for things. We were designed that way. I don't know if Job ever really blames God if he's just wanting to fly. So I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we all, of course, want answers. Like, this whole book is pretty much just Job and his friends arguing about who's right. Like, his friends say that Job must have done something wrong. Job is like, my life's terrible, but I also did nothing wrong. But man, my life's really terrible right now. And that's just kind of how it goes back and forth until like the very end of the book. So we want answers. What else? Is there anything else? Is it wrong to question God? Elaborate.
In the sense that we were asking questions, God only wants us to seek Him. And when we do that, it's through asking questions. That's kind of what makes us different from spiritual beings and angels. It's because we don't know without asking questions.
Okay, so God wants us to ask questions. Yeah, He wants us to be sure. And so, of course, if we're going to be sure about anything, then we're going to probably ask some questions. Hannah.
It's good to ask questions because if you just sit there and be like, okay, whatever, this is how it is, you're not right. Like, you need to have, like, that challenge of, okay, I have this question about something, and then they figure out, and we do the work, and they figure out the answer. Because if we just didn't question anything, nothing would be done. We would just be stuck.
Yeah.
So, being, okay, I have this question about something. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? What work am I going to do to figure out something?
Yeah. So it's important to question like things in general and figure out what's right and what's wrong because there's a right and wrong. So if there's a right and wrong, then we need to figure out what that is, and that requires us questioning. I knew one of y'all were about to say something. I can see it. Is it wrong to question God? All right.
I was going to read Hebrews 5, verse 7. I was talking about Jesus, and it says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications to God, cried his tears to him, who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence.
So
Kind of an attitude of like, if you're reverent about it, like God knows your heart when you ask him questions.
Okay, that's what I thought you were trying to get. Yeah, so there's an element of reverence that must be present if you're going to question. And I think that's super important to answer this question is how are you going about questioning the creator of the universe that is all-powerful? Are you doing it in a reverent way, or are you doing it disrespectfully, or in a way that doesn't honor him? Because I would argue that it's not wrong necessarily to question what is happening in your life or why God is doing something, but it would be wrong if you're doing it in a disrespectful or dishonorable way. But it's an interesting thing to think about because we don't often think about, is it okay to be questioning or to be angry or confused? And so it's just an interesting thing to chew on. What?
In the New Testament, when the Bereans, when they heard what the apostles were teaching, they weren't sure it was true or not, they went and searched the scriptures and they're commended for that. So kind of our own lives, we're not sure, maybe not so much of the gospel, but maybe about our lives. We can search the Bible and see what God would have us to do. We're commended for that as well.
Yeah, so if things are happening in our lives that we're confused about, I'd say a good first place to go would be God's Word, like what He's already told us. Is there some sort of instance in the Bible where someone handled this trial or tribulation in a certain way that we can learn from? Or does He give us some sort of advice or something that we can use to benefit us in this situation or to help us to be better servants in His kingdom through this trial that we're going through? So that's a good point.
Part of the questioning is
Understanding God's nature. I can go back to what earlier that Job never charged God with wrong. So he maintained the integrity and the nature of God, but wanted to know how does that fit into what's going on. Even his friends respond back to that a little bit. I was just looking at what I saw in chapter 11, verse 6, when Zophar talks, he says, "Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves." Now, all right, if you've done wrong, which we find out he didn't, but if you had done wrong, you're guilty, then God being just, he's supposed to do, he's got to hold up his end of whatever that might be. But then Job's on the other side, but I haven't done wrong. So God, how does this fit into who you are in nature? You're in charge of God's wrong, so he maintains God's integrity.
Yeah. And I mean, when you questioning, when you get into the questioning of, I guess, the nature of God, we can learn a lot of the nature of God throughout the Bible. And through instances with Israel, or with really any of his people, or people that aren't his people, and how he interacts with them, and what he tells us about himself, we can learn a lot about the nature of God. But that doesn't mean to say that there aren't still going to be questions that we have about it. And so, like Job, how he did not curse him with his lips, or he did not say anything against him with his lips, he still questions. And so, if both of those are to hold true, that means that Job did it in a way that is honorable or reverent, but he questioned. He's not sure of why what is happening is happening. But to go on, what?
I wanted to mention too, if you look in the book of Psalms, many times David, I mean, I don't think I've ever prayed to God the way he talks in some of the Psalms, right? But coming from David, coming from Job, I think part of that is the way they live their life up until that point kind of gives them some gratitude. We're told to come boldly before the throne, right? And pray.
Yeah.
And that's the idea that we're living in such a way that, not that we earn that, but somebody off the street that doesn't care about God, when he questions God, it's a little different from 20%.
Yeah.
So these guys are living in such a way that they're in constant communication with God, because we know that Job offered up sacrifices and prayed for his children and was constantly in prayer. So maybe a little latitude, I guess, what I'm giving. I'm not sure if that's the correct wording, but for these men of God to be able to question. Something else we got to realize that just because we ask doesn't make it wrong, but you don't have to really expect an answer right away too, right?
Yeah.
It's God's time, and it's that. And we'll see that later in this book.
Right.
When God lays it on the line for Job.
Yeah, I think that's also important. In Psalms, you see with David, he's saying words that you look at and you're like, wow, can we say that to God? Like, is that okay? But he's someone who's in a relationship with God, a man after God's own heart. It's the saying that we always use. This is someone who is, like you said, in constant communication with him. It's not like they're in a relationship. So anyways, we're going to fly through the rest of this. Zophar, he pretty much tells Job, like, you deserve more than what is, worse than what is already happening to you. And he just beats down Job even more, and Job is like, you're all terrible comforters. Like, you're awful at your jobs. And eventually this discourse stops because the men saw that Job was going to say he was righteous. Like, they weren't going to, like, Job wasn't going to give in. So then this kid Elihu, he's like mad with everyone, and he comes out of nowhere in chapter 32, and he's younger than the rest of them. And he's mad at Job because Job justified himself rather than God. And he's mad at the friends because they couldn't actually ever come up with an answer for Job's misfortune. And then he just lets everyone involved have it. And he condemns Job, and he hails God as just and as great. But really, he does absolutely nothing except regurgitate arguments that have already been had. And so because of his irrelevance, God interrupts him and completely ignores him. So Job's been sitting in these ashes with boils all over his body, and he's mourning the loss of everything that he's ever had. And he's being verbally beaten by his friends, and he's confused as to what he did to deserve all of this, and that he has no hope except in God, and then that hope appears in a whirlwind. He's been listening to this kid that's been wasting his time, and then in a whirlwind, God appears. And he finally interrupts Elihu, and he speaks directly to Job, and what does he say? He says, dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. And so God asked him, this is chapter 40, verse 7, and so God asked him a bunch of questions to basically say, like, oh, you think you can run the universe then? Like, do you know everything? Because I do. Like, are you all powerful? Because I am. And he asked him all of these questions to help Job, to lead Job to this conclusion. So eventually in chapter 40, verses 3 through 5, Job says, like, I am of small account, and he's inadequate, and he realizes he doesn't have the power that God has. And so in verses 7 through 14, God challenges Job. And he says that if he can prove that he is as powerful as God is, then God will admit that Job can save himself. And then he goes on to talk about these massive creatures, the behemoth and the leviathan, that he is greater than, and that nothing compares to him. And God realizes God's power, and Job realizes God's power, and he realizes his own ignorance. And so consequently, he repents because of this realization. And so God rebukes the terrible friends, except Elihu, because he's still irrelevant. And he restores Job's fortune because he endured the test. So let's learn some things from this in the last 3 minutes that we have. Faith is of no real value until it is tested. Job's life was full of wealth and good fortune, and his faith hadn't really been tested. When life becomes difficult, our faith becomes shaken. And that's when we prove where our identity lies, who we truly identify with. So is your faith circumstantial? Is it only strong? Is your faith only strong when your life is easy? But then when your physical life is shaken, then your spiritual life crumbles. Job's life was more than shaken. But by the end of this, his faith was stronger. And his faith goes from being formed in wealth to being formed by life's calamities and stronger because of it. God is always just. One of the main theological struggles of the book revolves around the question, can a God that is just allow his people to suffer? Is God truly just because of this? God cares for his people. But that doesn't mean that bad things aren't eventually going to happen. God allows us to face these trials and these difficulties, things that shake our worlds to determine how strong the foundation of our faith truly is. James 1, 2, and 3. True questioning reaps true answers. It may not be the answers that we expect, and it might not be on the timetable that we want them, like what Mr. Mark said, but we will definitely eventually get some sort of answer. Now, it's not wrong to be angry with God or necessarily to question him as long as it's done in a respectful manner, like what we said. And these true answers, they don't always mean that they're concrete or that there's something that we want to hear. Job wanted an answer. His friends wanted an answer. Elihu wanted an answer, and what they got was an understanding of God's power, and that was God's answer for them. And finally, comfort comes when God's incomprehensible nature is accepted. It's impossible for us to understand everything that God does and every decision that he makes, and we're not ever supposed to because we're not capable. It's impossible for us. He doesn't intend for us to know everything that happens, to know why everything that happens in our lives. He requires us to glorify him as we live out our lives. Honesty, and I'll let you go in just a second. Honesty and humility before God is much more important than understanding why. Man must completely yield to God. And then we can stop asking the question of why and start asking the question of how. How can I see God in this situation? How can I use what I've learned in this trial to glorify God? How can I use this to become stronger in my faith? We go from the question of why is this happening to how can I become a better servant of God because of this? Job's journey was difficult, and he endured a lot of physical and mental pain, but his faith was strengthened because of it. He went from questioning God, longing for justification of his pain, to gaining the understanding that we'll never comprehend all of the actions of God, but that we serve an all-powerful and completely just God that will reveal answers to us when he is ready for us to know. And so that's the story of Job, and I would encourage you to go study it on your own because there's a lot that we didn't actually get to cover. Do you want to say something?
One quick question.
Or comment. What evil did God create for this book of Job? Because he was attributed from Job 2 to Job 2 of evil. And I think mankind attributes evil to God, but in this story that we have ourselves, God is not a part of evil. He has never been. He is not that which creates evil. And I think it's good to kind of reflect on these things that are evil amongst us are not a part of God.
Yeah.
There has been
He is aware, and he does allow these things to happen. Only the things that we're able.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's an important word that was included was God allowed this to happen, but not that God created it or that God directly did it. And so that's an important theme because it would completely go against God's nature if he did. Anyways, I encourage you to study Job on your own. It's a very interesting book. Let's go to the auditorium.